in terms of about ourselves. So we started way back in meeting at conferences in the U.S. As well as other places. And that got a little tedious because every time we left, a year later, we go and renew itself. But we decided we should start actually meeting in Canada. So we began having this this annual summit, and then partnering with our other events in the provinces. So with the Ontario e-learning consortium, as well with Todd, as well as with other events that we had. So it's something that seemed to work quite well. But what we looked at, obviously, was looking at sort of our research piece. So we also partnered with an ongoing study that Michael Barber, who unfortunately is not here. He may chime in at some point in time for us and with us. But he's actually on the Rock in Newfoundland for personal reasons as well. So but we partnered with him, and that became a really important part of what CANeLearn started to define itself. And so you're going to hear a lot more about some of the other research that we've done as well in and about for this. But we continue to manage these events so that there are ways that we can come together with the rest of the work and the group. But then we also start to publish some research, as well as bring light to K-12 online learning, because there are still many misconceptions, and with the pandemic as well, it created a lot of differences in terms of what rich, robust, planned online learning is, as opposed to remote learning. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our presentation that we have. So we began to look at the differences in terms of what was announced, both starting in the spring of 2020, and then we looked at the fall of 2020 as well in terms of these. And now we've gotten to the point where we are looking at the series now coming into our 6th report. So we started with looking at the pandemic pedagogy, and we capitalized on work that was done by Charles Hodges and group. And they started to define the different phases in education that we were starting to see cycle through, both in post-secondary as well as in secondary and elementary. So K-12 areas as well as the post-sec. And so we ran a series of stories. And the last one on the far right, you'll see, is really the voices. So we did vignettes and invited parents and teachers and trustees, as well as students, to tell us what it was really like for them in doing this, what we call now remote learning. And we've just going to release, and you, as being part of this summit, will get the first crack at looking at this document, which we're hoping to have out in October, hopefully next week. I get to proof it this weekend. So looking at the whole piece across, and then we're going to do a final report in looking at pandemic pedagogy and analyzing and looking and critiquing what's happened. So you get the exclusive pre-release as part of this, and then we'll publish it to others afterwards. But Charles Hodges developed this particular chart, and it really, I think, captures some of the cycles that we have been through. And the first phase in the spring of 2020 was very rapid, and it was a very quick transition to remote teaching. And it was actually the term emergency remote teaching was used to describe what was happening. And the emergency remote teaching, in some cases, were teachers running around in a caravan of cars through the neighborhoods and to say hi to their elementary students, to know that we're still here, we care about you. So the social emotional connections were really predominant for that. And the academic issues kind of tapered a little bit, and everyone was basically given a pass from March through till June for their so-called progress. So, and then what happened is we started adding to the basics, but the planning in the schools was always to get students back. So that dominated the thinking, dominated the preparation for many, many people. So adding some of the basics back into that situation was still very much emergency remote transition of pushing a classroom out online virtually. So we are now likely, we can call it in phase 3, which is extended transition, but there is still turmoil. As you probably well know by reading the headlines, there's schools that are getting exposures. There's schools that are closing. There's schools, certainly in the US, have started earlier than most of us in Canada, other than Quebec, and maybe Michael will be able to tell us a little bit more of what's going on. But there are schools that are closing. So we're still, though, planned for kids, bums in seats and kids in school. So some did some planning around the transition to remote learning, others did not. But what we're looking to do is going into this next phase, which is really our focus now about what do we take that was good from what we learned during this period of time and move it forward to that. So in the first instance, before COVID, we had in-person learning and we had very robust distance or online learning that was already evolved. Not for everyone, but certainly was done. And we had rich content, curriculum, lots of integration of technologies to support that. But then the pandemic came and we did remote learning, which really was just a mashup of the regular classroom thrown online, concurrent teaching in some cases, and now certainly in Ontario, and we'll hear a little bit more about it after, is a hybrid where teachers are teaching kids in a classroom and online at the same time. Now, we're also seeing that in post-secondary, and that's one of the reasons why Joelle Nagel, who did this and put this PowerPoint together, is not able to be with us because she is frantically trying to get her skill level up, get everything prepped and ready to do that type of teaching. So this is amidst the background in the provinces now, which we're starting to find quite significant differences between how they're approaching this particular fall. For the most part, the provinces all have an online learning option. There is the exception, which again, Michael will talk to us, CANeLearn will talk to us a little bit about, in the Francophone French Quebec is not, but is now in the Anglophone is as well. And then there's a few others. PEI doesn't have their own option. It didn't announce anything, but that's because they use New Brunswick's online program through a reciprocal arrangement. And in the Yukon, Northwestern Territories and Nunavut, they are actually building their own programs, but they still use and have used programs from south of their borders. So the CBC did a really good sort of summary and synthesis of the closures of schools across, and they did an estimate in terms of the numbers. So you can see BC and Quebec had the least amount of closures, but Ontario had the largest amount. And when we look at it, so all jurisdictions then did some return to remote learning over the past year in some cases, but in some cases, schools or individual districts closed, but they really didn't enter into that full widespread lockdown. And Ontario was the only province that actually closed schools from March of last year through. So they're more apt to, well, I mean, it was a cycle. It was everything's wide open, everything's closed. Everything's wide open, everything's closed. It seemed to be from the outside what Ontario was doing. So the models around were really focused on health and safety protocols, blended staggered days, in some cases cohorts. We'll hear a little bit more from Chris Kennedy about that as well for that. And there were some that actually looked for and supported the special needs of students. But there was for logistical reasons, there was decisions around changing and making decisions as parents for things. Classrooms were using technologies that they had. In some cases at the start, the technologies were all over the map, but then they started to streamline to particular technologies so that there was consistencies for students to do that. Laptops were handed out, etc. Some shortages of technologies, but also what was interesting is some of the tried and true in the old distance correspondence education was used in the territories as well, because that was the best. And I just read an article recently this week about how they're sending out large scale videos and things on jump drives, and they're mailing them out to individual students because they don't have the bandwidth to stream them. So there's a lot of compensations that are going on around. What we learned from the vignettes when students and parents were involved in and teachers in remote teaching is that a lot of things were regards to the pace. There was issues around building engagement for many, many cases all through last year. The tried and true practices were being used, but also students had the personal issues and were reading and hearing more about it as well. And all of our eyes have always been on government announcements, but calls also for smaller class sizes within that. And then you know the rest of the experiences. So personally, school leaders were trying to be nimble, alert, and be on top of things. But you know, again, the issues were about high expectations and really the resources and garnering the resources and the skills and the training for teachers to be ready for that. So now when we're looking forward, which is what this event is about, and you're going to hear from people and folks that are actively involved in this, but plans for return to the normal are still not hitting the mark. We're still looking at shutdowns and issues and et cetera. But some jurisdictions started this year and said, you have to make a choice. We're not offering remote learning anymore. You either go virtual in one of the schools or you go in the classroom. And that's created some friction, some issues now a few weeks into the event. As well, is that some individual classes now, again, as I said, are being sent home. So what do we do now? So that's what we're going to look at today. If you do want to see some of this research, there's the site. I'll put the link in the chat as well for you. But basically, that's where we're at for us. So let me just turn this over to, I guess I will go with you, Michael, to give us a little bit more detail now about what's actually going on in Quebec.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Randy. Actually, you did an amazing job summarizing pretty much everything that is going on in Quebec. I put together a little PowerPoint, but I think I'm going to skip it and just give you a quick overview. Last year, Randy pointed out that in Quebec, we were in serious denial and we kept all our classes open. Online was used in the emergency situations only. And we're doing the same thing this year. There's no online option except for students who have what are called medical exemptions. Either they or members of their family have medical conditions that make it such that it's not safe for them to be in schools. Ironically, sorry about that, it's a little rain overhead. Ironically, what we're finding is that a number of schools are having outbreaks of, sorry, I'm doing the éclosion en français. They're having a lot of issues. And so I don't know how they're going to be able to manage during the entire course of the year to keep schools open. The big problem for us is that when the pandemic started in the first from March to June, everything went online. And as Randy described, it was emergency remote teaching. And it was a really pretty much a disaster. A lot of very poor work was done. And that left a very, very bitter taste in the mouths of a lot of people, a lot of educators, a lot of parents, and particularly our administrators who just now look at online education as a very, very poor distant cousin. It's really only used as a different, a last resort. It's ironic because Learn started teaching online back in 1999, and our students, of course, because we prepared and it wasn't an emergency situation, ended up scoring just as well, and in many cases higher than kids in the conventional classes, especially in their high school final exams in chemistry, physics, math, etc. They were actually doing better, and we did a lot of work over the years to try to offset the fact that it was online, that if there was any sense of isolation, that it was we were finding ways to compensate and bringing in community partners to process. But as I said, right now we're struggling to combat this notion that online is inferior. Yesterday, interestingly enough, I was at another conference on the future of learning, which was actually generally quite interesting. But I again heard on a number of occasions how well we're all anxious to get everyone back into the classroom, and I maintain that that's really not the approach that we should be taking. I presented at a conference on Monday to private colleges here in Quebec, and basically the debate was really around using and employing proper pedagogy online. But it remains a challenge. We have people within the ministry who are not thrilled with online education, simply because all they heard was the feedback from parents who were disenchanted with what went on during the emergency learning. Teaching. I don't want to call it learning because there's just not much of that happening. So yeah, this year, one of the things that we've been asked to do is to put together an online school for the medically exempt students. That's going actually well. It's the first time, and it's also becoming the model for what I'm hoping to propose to the ministry for our Quebec's first true virtual high school. It's not a done deal, but the minister has told us that he's open to discussing it. It's going to take some convincing. We have to demonstrate this year that we are successful, and I'm confident of that. But as I said, our challenge is a question of attitude and mindset. That what we do online is somehow or other inferior to what goes on in the classroom. And as I said, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, obviously. But that's our current struggle in Quebec.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And really, it's become a struggle for us for a number of years through CANeLearn. We're trying to bring light to the fact that robust online learning is quite capable. We're capable of doing that. It just takes planning. It takes some design. It takes a lot of time to determine, and skill building on teachers. And I think, Karen, you probably capture that as well in your text there. So that's why we went to great lengths, and a lot of the researchers in post-secondary in particular, obviously consider a lot more publishing and focus in post-secondary in online, went to great lengths to really define remote learning, which became the term, which is a different pedagogical approach. It's trying to take a classroom and put it online, whereas online, as we know, those preaching to the converted already, but it's a different approach. So I think the issue in Quebec is that would you not agree that it's the equating remote teaching to online learning?
They haven't made the distinction between the two. And in fact, at the conference where I was at on Monday, the directors of these private colleges were talking about using a blended learning approach, and their idea of what this was supposed to look like was putting a camera at the back of the classroom while the teacher taught. And again, they showed us an example of a teacher teaching, and of course, his back to the camera, turning around every so often to look at the kids in the classroom and saying, "You see, this is a blended, hybrid approach." And my notion, whenever I come across this kind of thing, and I do come across it often, is I said, put yourself in that position, the position of the learner. How long would you survive in an online environment watching the back of someone's head? I mean, it's boring enough when you're in a physical environment watching someone do that. Doing it online is just amplifying poor pedagogy. So they don't always like to hear that because it doesn't align with a particular mindset that they have. But you're right. It is it's a challenge. I think that we do have, incidentally, just a quick little background to all this is that we had parents who did sit in on some of what was going on in the online classes while we were doing emergency remote teaching back at the beginning of the pandemic. And they were so disgusted with what was going on in the online classes that a lot of them have decided to actually homeschool their students. And one of the people who was supposed to be on the panel today, Sinead, she's the principal of a Quebec's only private online school for homeschoolers, and the numbers for her have jumped significantly, and she just had to stop taking in registrations because parents simply weren't happy with what's going on in conventional classroom, nor were they happy with what was going on online. So it's had a lot of consequences for us, and I think it's like a reputation. It takes years and years to build up a positive reputation. It takes no time at all to destroy it, and that I think is a little bit of what I'm suffering through an online learning here, suffering through in Quebec.
Thank you, Michael. And interestingly, let's hear maybe from Claude and then Todd. I don't want you to necessarily steal all your thunder from when we get to the panel part. But how is the hybrid? What's happening in Ontario right now? So maybe Claude first talking about the Francophone.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Claude Pierre-Louis. I work for the CANeLearn. So it's for online learning. We're associated with the 12 French school boards in Ontario, and we're actually partners with the French school boards. So in terms of the pandemic in Ontario, while the government gave the school boards a mandate that they had to offer online learning, and so we already existed. So basically, our numbers tripled in terms of inscriptions, and then some school boards created their own online schools. So some students were at home and were having direct contact with their teachers at school, while we were offering more of asynchronous teaching. So basically, that's what's going on in Ontario. It was quite an adjustment for us. Like I said, our staff tripled, so we had massive training to do before the school year, and that was done in a 2-day period. There was a lot of staff too, teachers that were transferred, I guess, from their school board to the CANeLearn, since we were serving the students from different school boards. So we had a lot of teachers coming in from different school boards that needed to learn basically how to teach online. So like I said, the adjustment was quite tough for us, but at the same time, we're quite successful in the process. For us, what was very important is what we realized it's important of offering proper training and really having an empathetic approach to the students, to the staff needs, and to the students as well. So things are going well, and now the numbers are back down. So now we're just a little up from our previous numbers in terms of students that are enrolled with us. But then now we're seeing COVID cases going up in schools. Some classes are closing, so we're not sure what's going to be the short-term and long-term impact for us in terms of an organization. But I think we reacted pretty well to the pandemic, and I think we grew a lot as an organization. And so we're just trying to make the most of the pandemic here in Ontario.
Thanks, Claude. Appreciate that. Yes, and again, we're in the edge of uncertainty that's starting to come forward to us. Todd, is there anything you want to add here, or just hold it for the panel?
No, I can add it quickly, and that I'll try to avoid any duplication. So here in Ontario, we're well positioned for not for the immediate closure, because that was lifting the veil from a lot of people, right? From a lot of the systems, a lot of the programs and whatnot. But certainly we had a lot of advantages perhaps over other parts of the country with regards to some of the structures we already had in place, which I'll talk about when we get to the panel discussion. But here in Ontario right now, our schools are open. Students have an option between attending face-to-face, which I've got 4 kids and they're attending face-to-face, and then they also have the option mandatory option for all school boards to offer learn at home programs. So we've been spending a lot of our time helping boards set up their virtual schools. And so those have been running as well. So a little bit of difference between the virtual schools and the full-blown online learning, which we've been doing forever. And that's the virtual schools, the learn at home programs, they run synchronously. And when our schools close and my kids come home and all of the kids in the provinces go home, then they still have the same teacher. And those are run synchronously as well. And there is a minimum amount of time that they have real-time contact with the teacher in every day. So yeah, I don't want to just to avoid duplication. I'll just stop it there, Randy, and I'll address a lot of it when we get to the panel. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that. So unfortunately, we don't have anyone from the Maritime right now. People are busy and slammed. And we've got a number of people that did sign up for this that are probably going to be watching the archives. So just be aware that there's probably half the numbers are in the live meeting here, but the other half will be catching some of the archives for that. So Frank, maybe you can just give us a little bit more about what's going on in the West, and I'll leave it to you to include BC, Saskatchewan, whatever the borders, Alberta, because there's some interesting things.
So I probably should have mentioned it at the top. I'm based in Alberta. I'm in Calgary. So if I look to the east, I mean, we have board representation from Saskatchewan, and you'll notice that they're not here today. The reason that they were not here, or at least our previous board member, is when we talk about that differentiation between emergency remote teaching and intentionally designed online learning, the online schools in Saskatchewan, which were there, not heavily utilized, went up exponentially in their access from schools, from teachers, from students. And so there was a huge amount of pressure on that system, which they're still trying to parse through now. So that's kind of where Saskatchewan is. I can see that they're becoming much more intentional in their online design. Alberta and BC are interesting because they're side by side, and they have literally been for years opposite ends of the pendulum on this. For years, Alberta was incredibly centralized through an organization called the Alberta Distance Learning Center, whereas BC, they have virtual schools or online schools in numerous jurisdictions. And I don't think it's a competitive model per se. I think that's how it started out, but that's not what it's morphed into. What's happened this past year is things are starting to get a little flippity floppity. So in Alberta, there was a move away from the centralization. So the Alberta Distance Learning Center was closed at the end of last school year. And consequently, grants have been made available to every jurisdiction in the province, if they choose to develop their own online learning school, organization, what have you. And so some places are taking those learnings from the emergency remote teaching and establishing their own online schools. It's not a tidal wave, but it's there. In contrast, in BC, there is a greater level of cooperation and the development of a more centralized support, not a centralized delivery like was in Alberta, but there is a little more centralization going into resource development and things like that. So it is, the two provinces have occupied opposite parts of the spectrum, and right now are just in the process of morphing into one another. And I expect we're going to meet somewhere in the middle. But that's been the big thing happening in the West. And in Alberta, one of the frustrating parts of this is the Department of Education, the Ministry of Education, for years funded the Alberta Distance Learning Center to develop and release course resources, both online and print correspondence. They ran both. And so there is a wealth of resources that have been developed by that center. And I think one of the frustrating things is that as the new year has begun, those resources are still somewhere in the labyrinth of the ministry. So there was an expectation that even though the center was closing, that those materials and those resources would be made available to schools and jurisdictions. And to this point, that has not occurred. So that's a bit frustrating.
I think, Frank, that's been the case in Alberta for years. I can recall back in the early 2000s of going around to some of the fledgling online schools that were created. And I said, well, tell me about Learn Alberta, because you've got all these resources in BC. Because I'm centered in BC, we didn't have any of those. Teachers couldn't find them. Oh, well, I think it's here. I got a login, but it's so complicated. And then it didn't resonate for them.
And as a result, what's happened is Learn Alberta has actually, I mean, a lot of those resources were actually purchased by the Teachers Association in this province. And so they were so problematic in terms of finding, but everyone knew their value, that the association actually stepped forward and say, well, we'll take them, and we'll at least have a central hub through our library where they can access that stuff.
Well, and I know Michael is at Learn in Quebec. That's what you do is build and provide those resources for the Anglophones in the province.
Just add, they're now being used by our French counterparts as well. A lot of them are being translated. So yeah, we do a lot of that. And incidentally, just as a shout out, we try to make everything as an open educational resource. We've eliminated a lot of the usernames and passwords, because the moment you put the slightest little obstacle in the way to resources, they don't use them. So shout out to promoting OERs.
And to go back to what we always think of in Canada is Alberta is the wild, wild west because of its connection through to Texas and oil industry, et cetera, et cetera. In actual fact, BC is the crazy wild west in the sense that all of the independent programs were developed because they removed the restrictions in policy back a number of years ago, and every school district could have their online school, and they all went after, and they did per course funding. So all the schools districts were competing against each other to try to get students to sign up with their programs, which was crazy heady days, et cetera. But nothing was provided centrally in BC. So the consortiums, the school districts started to collaborate together to support each other. And I know Karen was involved in, fellow who had texted as well, is involved in some of that. It's an interesting story. But Bruce Weitzel, who's on our board as well, has now founded what was first the BC Learning Network, who shared and developed courses and shared resources, brokered licenses to support things, did the kind of things that a centralized ministry would do, but our particular in BC was not doing. But then now it's become the Western Canadian Learning Network, because in Alberta there's school districts that are joining into that consortium in order to share and get some of the resources. So that's a little bit of the hodgepodge. Is there anything else to add in, Vince, maybe from your perspective as well, in what's been going on as we wrap up this part of it?
I think in Alberta, we don't really know what's going to happen. I think it's all guesswork right now, and it's because everything has just been turned upside down, and it really is just a mess. And I hate to say it, but I mean, and the funding model is just really not. It's not there to support like the organization Frank has, and that. So there's some challenges, and I think the big thing that we need to keep driving home is the value and importance of online or even blended learning, and that it is effective and it does work. And that's the message we need to keep pounding away at, that we need to look at different ways of doing instruction and reaching our kids, and ensuring that they're all learning at different places.
Great. Thanks very much.